If this is my last meal, might as well share it with someone hungrier than me." The words left Thomas's lips before he could stop himself. He glanced at the stale sandwich in his hand, a half-eaten, slightly crushed turkey and cheese sub he'd found near the dumpster behind a deli. It wasn't much, but it was something. His stomach twisted in protest, but another growl made him glance down. Only, it wasn't his own. A pair of deep brown eyes stared up at him. The dog was skinny, ribs pressing against a dirty coat of fur, patches of hair missing along its side. It stood a few feet away, hesitant, nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Thomas could tell the poor thing was starving. The kind of hunger that sat deep in the bones, the kind he knew too well. He crouched slowly, breaking the sandwich in half and holding out a piece. "Come on, buddy. I won't hurt you." The dog hesitated but stepped forward, ears flicking, tail low. It sniffed the offering, then snatched it from Thomas's hand, chewing frantically as though it thought the food might vanish if it didn't eat fast enough. Thomas chuckled. "Yeah, I get it. Gotta eat while you can." He settled on the sidewalk, watching the dog gulp down the rest. "What's your name, huh?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but it sat down too, licking the last crumbs from the ground before glancing back up at him. There was something in those eyes. Not just desperation, not just hunger. Something else. A kind of quiet understanding. Thomas leaned back against the brick wall of the alley, sighing. His backpack, worn and tattered, sat beside him with all his worldly possessions. An old sweatshirt, a couple of blankets, and a notebook filled with sketches he'd made over the years. He used to draw houses, buildings, places people could call home. Ironic, considering he didn't have one himself anymore. "Guess we're in the same boat, huh?" he muttered, glancing at the dog. "No home, no family, just scraping by." The dog inched closer, curling up next to him, pressing its bony side against his leg. Thomas hesitated but reached out, running his fingers gently through the matted fur. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a deep sigh, settling in as if it had known him forever. A small smile tugged at the corners of Thomas's lips. He hadn't had company in a long time. People passed him by every day, barely sparing him a glance. But this dog saw him. Maybe he wasn't invisible after all. The streetlights flickered on as night fell. The city never slept, but in this part of town, things slowed down. Thomas wrapped his blanket around himself, glancing at the dog curled up beside him. He didn't know why, but he felt a little less alone. "All right," he murmured. "Guess you need a name?" He looked at the dog's dirty fur, the patches missing, the battle scars it carried. He thought for a moment before nodding. "How about Rusty?" The dog lifted its head, ears twitching at the sound. "Rusty it is," Thomas said. "Welcome to the team, buddy." That night, for the first time in a long while, Thomas slept a little easier. And as he drifted off, Rusty curled up closer, keeping the cold away, as if understanding they were in this together now. The morning came too soon. Thomas stirred as the sun peeked over the rooftops, warming the pavement beneath him. He groaned, rubbing his face. Rusty stretched, letting out a low yawn before standing and shaking himself off. "Morning, pal," Thomas said. "Guess we should figure out breakfast." His stomach growled, and he dug into his bag, pulling out a couple of crackers he'd saved from a convenience store handout the day before. He broke one in half, handing part to Rusty, who took it eagerly. "Not much, but we'll manage." He pushed himself up, brushing the dust from his jeans. The city was waking up around him, people rushing to work, horns honking in the distance. Thomas knew the best places to try his luck. A coffee shop where the owner sometimes left leftovers by the back door, a food truck that handed out extra sandwiches if you caught them before they packed up for the day. It wasn't much, but he made do. Rusty trotted beside him, head high, tail wagging slightly. Thomas smiled at the sight. It had been a long time since he'd had a reason to smile. By midday, luck was on their side. Thomas managed to snag a half-eaten bagel from a trash bin outside a bakery, and a kind woman at the park gave Rusty a few scraps from her lunch. They sat together under a tree, sharing their small feast. "Not bad for day one, huh?" Thomas said, scratching behind Rusty's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing in contentment. Thomas exhaled, looking around. The city had never felt like home, but with Rusty by his side, maybe it wasn't so bad. And then it happened. As they sat there, a car screeched to a stop nearby. The driver, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive-looking coat, stepped out, her gaze locked on Rusty. "Oh my God," she whispered, hand covering her mouth. "Charlie?" Thomas blinked. "Huh?" The woman hurried forward, eyes brimming with tears. Rusty stiffened but didn't run. Instead, he stared at her, ears twitching. "It's him," she said, voice shaking. "That's my dog." Thomas frowned. "Your dog?" The woman nodded, dropping to her knees. "I lost him almost a year ago. I've been looking everywhere." Rusty didn't move at first, but then slowly, he stepped closer. The woman reached out, fingers trembling as she touched his fur. A small whimper escaped Rusty's throat before he suddenly lunged forward, burying his face in her shoulder, tail wagging wildly. Thomas sat there, watching the reunion, a strange ache in his chest. Rusty had a family, a home. And just like that, Thomas's world felt a little emptier. Thomas stared at Rusty, Charlie, as the woman had called him, and tried to swallow the tightness in his throat. He should be happy. Rusty had found his family, a real home. That was the best possible outcome. But then, why did it feel like he was losing something, like a part of him was being chipped away? The woman cradled Rusty's face in her hands, murmuring soft words Thomas couldn't hear. Rusty wagged his tail so hard his entire body wiggled. He licked the woman's hands, her cheeks, whimpering excitedly. There was no hesitation, no confusion. He remembered her. Thomas exhaled slowly. "Guess he's your dog, then." The woman turned her tear-filled eyes toward him. "Yes, I thought he was gone forever." He nodded, forcing himself to smile. "Looks like you found each other." She studied him for a moment, eyes flicking over his worn-out clothes, the tattered backpack slung over his shoulder. "Where did you find him?" Thomas scratched the back of his head. "He found me, really. Just showed up yesterday. Figured we'd stick together a while." The woman wiped her eyes, offering a small smile. "I can't tell you how grateful I am. He went missing last winter. We searched everywhere, flyers, shelters, everything. I thought—" Her voice cracked, and she buried her fingers in Rusty's fur. "I thought he was dead." Rusty licked her cheek again, tail still going. The woman took a shaky breath before looking at Thomas again. "I want to give you something. As a thank you." Thomas shook his head. "You don't have to do that." "I insist," she said, already reaching into her purse. "It's the least I can do, please." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. He didn't want charity, didn't want to feel like this was some kind of transaction. But before he could say anything else, she pressed a folded bill into his hand. He hesitated, then glanced down. $100 bill. His throat went dry. That was more money than he'd seen in months. "I hope this helps," she said softly. "I wish I could do more." Rusty was still pressed against her, his tail thumping the ground. The warmth of the night they'd shared, the quiet understanding, the comfort, flickered like an ember inside Thomas, but it was already fading. Rusty wasn't his dog. He never had been. Thomas cleared his throat. "Take care of him." The woman smiled. "I will." He gave Rusty one last look. "See ya, buddy." Rusty whined. He pulled away from the woman for a moment, stepping toward Thomas. His tail slowed, his ears lowering slightly. Thomas shook his head, forcing another smile. "Go on, boy. You're home now." Rusty hesitated, then turned back to the woman. She clipped a leash onto his collar, murmuring soft reassurances. Thomas shoved the bill into his pocket and turned away before he could change his mind. His feet carried him down the sidewalk, past the park, past the alley where he and Rusty had shared their first meal. He didn't look back. The city stretched ahead, cold and indifferent. Thomas walked without thinking, each step heavier than the last. Rusty was gone. That was good. That was the way things were supposed to be. Then why did it feel so wrong? A week passed. Thomas moved through the city as he always had, his days a blur of searching for food, finding a safe place to sleep, avoiding the eyes of people who didn't want to see him. The $100 had helped. He'd stretched it as far as he could, buying a few warm meals, a second-hand coat from a thrift store. But it was gone now. He told himself he was fine, that nothing had changed. But the nights felt lonelier. The cold bit deeper. And every time he closed his eyes, he thought of a dog curled up beside him, keeping him warm. One evening, as he sat on a bench in a quiet part of town, watching the world pass him by, he heard footsteps approach. He didn't bother looking up. People usually ignored him. Then a voice said, "Hey." He glanced up, blinking. The woman from before stood in front of him, hands tucked into the pockets of her expensive coat. And beside her, tail wagging furiously, was Rusty. Thomas straightened. Hey." Rusty barked once, then bounded forward before the leash could stop him. He pressed his face into Thomas's lap, tail whipping back and forth. Thomas instinctively ran a hand through his fur, his chest tightening. The woman gave a small laugh. "He hasn't stopped looking for you." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" She sat down beside him. "Since the day we took him home, he's been restless. He waits by the door, whines at night. It's like he's missing something." Thomas looked down at Rusty, who was now sitting at his feet, looking up at him like no time had passed at all. "I think," the woman continued, "he misses you." Thomas swallowed. "He's got a good home now. He'll get used to it." She hesitated, then said, "I know I just met you, and I don't want to overstep, but do you have anywhere to stay?" Thomas tensed. "I manage." "I know how hard things can be," she said gently. "And I know it's not easy accepting help. But Rusty loves you, and I think you love him too." Thomas didn't answer. He just kept petting Rusty's fur, his fingers tightening slightly. The woman exhaled, as if making a decision. "I own a small business. Nothing big, just a bookstore. We could use some help around the place, organizing, stocking shelves. It's not much, but it's a job." Thomas blinked. "You're offering me a job?" She nodded. "A job. And a place to stay. It's not fancy, but it's warm. Rusty would be with you every day." Thomas felt like the world had tilted slightly. People didn't do this. They didn't just offer things like this to guys like him. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The woman smiled. "Because you saved him. And because I think he saved you too." Thomas looked at Rusty, who was watching him with those same deep brown eyes. A week ago, he had thought letting Rusty go was the right thing to do. But now, sitting here, feeling the weight of the dog pressed against his legs. He wasn't so sure. He took a breath. "What's the catch?" The woman shook her head. "No catch, just a fresh start." Thomas looked down at Rusty again, then back at her. The city stretched around them, vast and uncaring. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to walk it alone anymore. Thomas shifted on the bench, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on him in a way he hadn't expected. A job. A place to stay. It sounded too good to be real, and real was something he couldn't afford to hope for. Rusty pressed against his leg, warm and solid. The dog didn't care about uncertainty or fear. He just sat there, tongue slightly out, looking at Thomas like he had all the answers in the world. Thomas exhaled. "I don't know." The woman tilted her head slightly. "What don't you know?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "Everything. If this is some kind of setup, if it's real, if I can even handle a job." She folded her hands in her lap, studying him. "I get it. Trust is hard. But you don't have to decide right now. Just come see the place. No strings." Rusty let out a small whine and pawed at Thomas's knee. His stomach twisted. He wanted to say yes, wanted to let himself believe that maybe things could be different, but he'd learned long ago that things that seemed too good usually were. Still, what did he have to lose? He sighed. "All right, I'll come look." The woman smiled, standing. "Good." She adjusted Rusty's leash, offering it to Thomas. "Here, you hold on to him." He hesitated before taking it, and Rusty wagged his tail, trotting alongside as they walked through the city. Thomas kept his gaze low, instinctively wary of the passing people. He was used to being ignored, but walking beside the woman and Rusty, he felt the weight of eyes on him in a way he wasn't prepared for. She led him through a quiet street lined with older buildings. A small bookstore sat nestled between a bakery and a coffee shop, its sign slightly faded but welcoming. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. "Here we are," she said. "It's not much, but it's mine." Thomas hesitated at the entrance, unsure if he was really allowed in. The place smelled like paper and coffee, a scent so warm it nearly threw him off balance. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with books in every size and color. A counter sat in the corner, with an old cash register and a tiny stool. A back door led to a space he couldn't see. Rusty trotted inside without hesitation, sniffing at the shelves. Thomas stood frozen. The woman turned back to him. "You coming in?" He cleared his throat and stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling. The air was warmer in here, quieter, safe. She moved behind the counter, setting down her bag. "I've owned this place for 10 years. It's nothing fancy, but it's steady." She glanced at him. "I could use some help running it, just organizing books, maybe handling the register once you're comfortable. And there's an apartment upstairs. It's not huge, but it's warm." Thomas felt something inside him lock up. He didn't deserve this. He didn't know how to accept it. "Why are you doing this?" She leaned on the counter, expression soft. "Because you helped my dog when he needed someone. And because everyone deserves a chance." He looked away, rubbing his arm. "I don't know anything about books." "You'll learn?" "I don't," he stopped himself. He didn't have an excuse, only fear. Rusty sat by his feet, looking up at him expectantly, like he was waiting for Thomas to figure it out. The woman let the silence settle before speaking again. "Just try it. 1 week. If you hate it, no hard feelings." A week. He could do a week. Maybe. His fingers tightened around Rusty's leash. Okay. Her smile was small, but warm. Good. I'll show you the apartment. She led him through the back door, up a narrow flight of stairs. The apartment was small, just a kitchenette, a couch, and a single bedroom, but it was clean. And it had a bed, and a lock on the door. Thomas let out a slow breath, his chest tightening in a way he couldn't explain. You can stay as long as you need, she said. As long as you want. He nodded, still unsure of what he was agreeing to, still waiting for the catch. But Rusty hopped onto the couch like he already belonged there, tail wagging, and something in Thomas's chest cracked just a little. Maybe, just maybe, he could belong too. Thomas lay on the small bed in the apartment, staring at the ceiling. It had been years since he'd slept on something this soft, something that didn't force his body to adjust to the unforgiving pavement or the hard surface of a shelter cot. The room was quiet, except for Rusty's soft breathing beside him. The dog had claimed the couch, his tail thumping against the fabric now and then as he shifted in his sleep. Thomas turned his head, watching the slow rise and fall of Rusty's chest. The warmth of the dog's presence filled the space in a way he didn't know he needed. He exhaled, closing his eyes, forcing himself to believe that this was real, that he wasn't going to wake up on a cold sidewalk with nothing but the sky over his head. Morning came gently. The smell of coffee drifted up from the bookstore below, the soft hum of life stirring in the early hours. Thomas sat up, rubbing his face, still caught between the wariness of survival and the cautious curiosity of hope. Rusty stretched and yawned, his tail wagging as soon as their eyes met. All right, Thomas muttered. Let's see what today looks like. He made his way downstairs, finding the woman, Sarah, he reminded himself, standing behind the counter, steaming mug in hand. She glanced up, offering a small smile. Morning, she said. Thomas nodded. Morning. Rusty trotted ahead, circling Sarah before sitting at her feet, looking up expectantly. She laughed. You're already spoiled, aren't you? She reached down to scratch behind his ears before glancing at Thomas. I made extra coffee. Help yourself. Thomas hesitated before nodding. Thanks. He poured himself a cup, taking a tentative sip. The warmth spread through him, a reminder of things he'd gone without for too long. He cleared his throat. So, what do you need me to do? Sarah gestured around the store. Just get familiar with the layout today. Customers usually trickle in throughout the morning, but it's not too busy until the afternoon. Thomas nodded, glancing around at the shelves stacked with books of all sizes. He hadn't stepped foot in a bookstore in years. He ran his fingers along the spines of some of them, feeling the worn textures, the crisp newness of others. Sarah studied him for a moment before speaking. I meant what I said yesterday. No pressure. If this isn't for you, that's okay. Thomas shook his head. No, he exhaled. I just don't want to mess this up. Sarah smiled. You won't? The first few hours passed quietly. Thomas familiarized himself with the organization of the books, the sections that customers seemed to gravitate toward the most. He watched as Sarah interacted with the patrons, older regulars who chatted about their latest reads, young students looking for recommendations. She knew them all by name, their preferences, their stories. He wondered what it was like to be part of something like that, to be seen, to be expected. Rusty, of course, had no hesitation about making himself part of the store's daily routine. He sprawled near the counter, accepting belly rubs from anyone who offered, his tail wagging at the slightest bit of attention. It was clear he belonged here. Thomas wasn't sure if he did. By the afternoon, more people filled the store, and Sarah guided him through the register process. It wasn't complicated, but his hands shook slightly the first time he handled a transaction. He wasn't used to people trusting him with money, with anything, really. But Sarah didn't hover, didn't question his ability. She just let him work through it, offering quiet reassurance when he needed it. As the day wound down, Thomas found himself settling into the rhythm of things. He stacked books, helped customers find titles, even engaged in a few brief conversations. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in a long time. When the last customer left and Sarah locked the door, she turned to him. "So?" Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "Wasn't bad." Sarah laughed. "That's a start." Rusty trotted over, nudging Thomas's hand with his nose. He scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the quiet space of the store. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "I was thinking, I have an extra key for the store. If you're planning to stay, you should have it." Thomas blinked. "A key?" She nodded, pulling a small key from her pocket and holding it out to him. "It's your space too now." His fingers curled around the metal, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. He swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Sarah smiled, sensing his hesitation. "No rush. Just think about it." Thomas nodded, slipping the key into his pocket. That night, as he lay in bed with Rusty curled up beside him, he found himself turning the key over in his fingers, the weight of it unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. For the first time in a long time, he had something to hold on to. Thomas woke to the soft sound of Rusty's breathing beside him, the warmth of the dog's body pressed against his legs, a steady comfort he hadn't realized he needed. Morning light filtered through the small window, casting a gentle glow on the apartment's modest furnishings. He sat up, running a hand over his face as he tried to shake the remnants of sleep. It had been years since he had anything that resembled a routine, but waking up in the same place 2 days in a row felt different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Rusty stretched beside him, yawning with a loud huff before hopping off the bed and trotting toward the door, his tail wagging in anticipation. All right, Thomas muttered, standing. "Let's get moving." He slipped on his shoes and grabbed the key Sarah had given him the night before. He still wasn't sure what to make of it, the weight of it in his pocket like a reminder that he was being given something he didn't quite know how to accept. Trust. A chance. A place. Downstairs, the bookstore was quiet, the smell of paper and coffee lingering in the air. Sarah was already behind the counter, flipping through a book while sipping her morning coffee. She looked up when Thomas and Rusty entered, offering a small smile. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Thomas replied, still getting used to the fact that he had someone to say it to. Rusty padded over to Sarah, sitting expectantly by her feet. She chuckled and reached down to scratch his head. "You've got him spoiled already." Thomas smirked. "He came that way." Sarah straightened, nodding toward the back room. "I stocked a few new titles last night. If you want to start by sorting those onto the shelves, that'd be great." He nodded and headed toward the back, Rusty following close behind. The work wasn't hard, just repetitive. But there was something grounding about it, lining up the books, making sure they were in the right sections, finding space for the new ones. It was simple, but it gave him something to do, something to focus on. The bell over the door chimed, and Thomas glanced up as the first customer of the day walked in. A middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose scanned the shelves with practiced familiarity. Sarah greeted her by name, striking up a conversation about a book series she had recently ordered. Thomas kept his head down, continuing his work, but he couldn't help but listen. There was a rhythm to it, the way Sarah talked to customers, the way they trusted her recommendations. She had built something here, something real. He wondered what that felt like, to belong to a place in the way she seemed to. As the day went on, more customers trickled in. Some were regulars, chatting easily with Sarah. Others were newcomers, hesitantly browsing, looking for something they couldn't quite name. Thomas helped when needed, pointing people in the right direction, ringing up purchases when Sarah was busy. Rusty, of course, made himself right at home, stretching out by the counter and soaking up attention from anyone who offered. More than one customer commented on how lucky the store was to have a dog around. Thomas found himself nodding along, though he knew the truth. He was the lucky one. When the afternoon lull hit, Sarah leaned against the counter, sipping her second cup of coffee. "You're doing good, you know," she said, watching him from over the rim of her mug. Thomas shrugged. "It's just stacking books." "It's more than that," she said. "You're picking things up fast, and the customers like you." He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he just nodded. Compliments weren't something he was used to. Sarah studied him for a moment before setting her coffee down. "You ever thought about what comes next?" Thomas frowned. "Next?" She nodded. "I mean, you're here now. You've got a job, a place to stay. But what do you want, long term?" The question caught him off guard. For years, the only thing he had wanted was to make it through the day, to find enough food to keep going, to find shelter when the weather turned bad. But now there was something more. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never really thought about it." Sarah didn't push, just nodded. "That's okay. You don't have to figure it all out today." Thomas appreciated that. The idea of planning for the future was overwhelming enough without feeling pressured to have an answer right away. Rusty let out a content sigh, resting his head on Thomas's foot. He looked down at the dog and felt a strange sense of stability. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. As the day wound down and the last customer left, Thomas helped Sarah close up shop. She handed him the key again, this time with less hesitation on his part. He pocketed it, the weight of it feeling less foreign, more like something that was slowly becoming his. That night, back in the apartment, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the key in his hand. Rusty curled up beside him, letting out a soft sigh in his sleep. Thomas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Maybe he didn't know exactly what was next. Maybe he was still figuring things out. But for the first time in years, he had a place to start. Thomas woke up to the familiar sound of Rusty stretching beside him, the dog's nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. He rubbed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he adjusted to the light filtering through the small window. Another morning. Another day where he wasn't waking up to the cold pavement or the uncertainty of where he'd find his next meal. The thought was still something he hadn't quite wrapped his head around. Rusty nudged his hand, tail wagging slightly. Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears, offering a small smile. "All right, buddy, let's get moving." He climbed out of bed and got dressed quickly, still not used to having more than one set of clothes that weren't tattered or worn thin. The bookstore below was quiet as he made his way downstairs. The scent of fresh coffee filled the space, and Sarah was already behind the counter, flipping through a ledger. "Morning," she greeted, looking up with a smile. "Morning." He took a seat on one of the stools near the counter, watching as she marked a few numbers in the book. "Busy?" She sighed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Just going over inventory. I've been thinking of ordering some new titles, but I want to make sure we're not overstocked on anything." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure how all of that worked. He had never paid attention to things like sales or stock before. It was strange, being in a place where those things mattered. Sarah set the ledger aside and poured them both a cup of coffee. "How are you settling in?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure how to put it into words. "It's different. Good, though." She studied him for a second before nodding. "Good. That's what I was hoping for." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence before the first customer of the day arrived. Thomas slipped into the usual rhythm, organizing books, helping customers when needed, and keeping an eye on Rusty, who had taken it upon himself to be the official bookstore greeter. The afternoon was steady, but not overwhelming, giving Thomas enough time to adjust to the workflow. He found himself recognizing familiar faces, remembering what certain customers liked to read. It was a strange feeling, being part of something, even in a small way. A few hours later, Sarah stepped out for a break, leaving Thomas at the register. He was in the middle of sorting a new stack of books when the bell above the door chimed. A man walked in, glancing around as if searching for something specific. He was dressed well, pressed shirt, expensive shoes, but there was something in the way he held himself that made Thomas instinctively wary. "Can I help you find something?" Thomas asked. The man's gaze landed on him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Thomas's stomach tightened. "Thomas?" The man took a slow step closer. "I thought that was you." Thomas's throat went dry. He knew that voice. It had been years since he'd heard it, but he hadn't forgotten. Eric, his older brother. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rusty, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, moved closer to Thomas's side, his tail low. Thomas exhaled sharply, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Didn't expect to see you here." Eric studied him, his expression unreadable. "I could say the same thing." There was no accusation in his voice, but there didn't need to be. The last time they had spoken had been a fight, one that ended with Thomas walking away and never looking back. Eric glanced around the store. "You work here?" Thomas nodded. "Yeah." Something in his brother's face shifted. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but hesitated. "I've been trying to find you." Thomas stiffened. "Why?" Eric sighed. "Because you disappeared, Thomas." "Mom," he stopped, running a hand over his face. "She's been worried sick." Thomas clenched his jaw. "She stopped being worried a long time ago." "That's not true." Eric's voice was quiet but firm. We didn't know if you were even alive." Rusty pressed against Thomas's leg, grounding him. He looked at his brother, at the familiar yet distant face, and felt the weight of years between them. "What do you want, Eric?" Eric hesitated. "I just want to talk." Thomas wanted to say no, to tell him to leave, but something in his brother's face, the same guarded hope he had once carried himself, made him pause. Sarah returned then, stepping inside just in time to catch the tension in the air. She looked between them before glancing at Thomas. "Everything okay?" Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "Yeah, this is my brother." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, she offered Eric a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." Eric nodded. "Same." The silence stretched until Sarah patted the counter. "I'm going to step out back for a bit. Take your time." Thomas swallowed hard. He didn't know if he was ready for this conversation, but it seemed like he didn't have a choice. Eric glanced at Rusty, who still hadn't moved from Thomas's side. "Nice dog." Thomas let out a short breath. Yeah, he's a good one. Eric nodded slowly. Can we talk? Thomas hesitated before finally nodding. Yeah, I guess we can. Thomas stood in the middle of the store, trying to keep his breathing steady. Rusty was still at his side, his soft fur brushing against Thomas's leg. It was the only thing keeping him from bolting out the door. Eric hadn't changed much since Thomas had last seen him, nearly a decade ago. His older brother still had that same air of confidence, the way he carried himself, as if he always knew the right answers. But now there was something different. A shadow behind his eyes that made Thomas pause. I don't know what to say, Thomas admitted, his voice low. Eric folded his arms, leaning slightly against the nearest bookshelf. You don't have to say anything right now. I need to understand what happened. Thomas shook his head. It's not that simple. Maybe not, but disappearing for years without a word? Not even a hint of where you were, or if you were okay? Eric's voice was even, but there was no mistaking the edge in his tone. You owe me an explanation. I don't owe you anything, Thomas shot back before he could stop himself. His fists clenched at his sides. You don't know what it was like. You had everything handed to you. Eric's face tightened. You think it was easy for me just because I stayed? Because I worked for what I have? Thomas, He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. I'm not here to argue. I'm here because I care. I'm here because Mom cares. Mom, Thomas muttered. Right. Eric ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. She never stopped waiting for you to come home. Thomas felt Rusty nudge his leg again, grounding him. The dog's presence was a reminder of the life he had built, however fragile it felt. He took a deep breath. Look, I appreciate that you came all this way, but I don't have the answers you're looking for, not now. Eric hesitated, his jaw tight. Fine. I'll give you time. But don't shut me out, Thomas. Not again. Thomas glanced at him, his voice softening. I'll think about it. Eric nodded slowly. Okay. I'll leave my number with Sarah. When you're ready, call me. He turned toward the door, pausing once before stepping outside. The bell jingled as it closed behind him. Thomas sank onto the stool behind the counter, letting out a long breath. Rusty sat beside him, resting his head on Thomas's knee. He ran a hand over the dog's fur, his thoughts racing. Seeing Eric again stirred up memories he had buried long ago, and now they were fighting their way to the surface. He didn't know if he was ready to face them, but he didn't have much of a choice anymore. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Sarah noticed the tension in Thomas's shoulders and gave him space, focusing on her work while Thomas continued to help customers. Rusty seemed to sense his unease, staying close and offering the silent companionship that only a dog could provide. When the store finally closed for the day, Sarah gently placed a hand on Thomas's arm. You okay? Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Yeah, just wasn't expecting that. She offered a small smile. If you need to talk, I'm here. He appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't ready to unpack everything just yet. Thanks, he said simply. That evening, Thomas found himself sitting on the couch in the apartment, staring at the slip of paper Sarah had handed him earlier. Eric's phone number was scrawled in familiar handwriting. It had been so long since he'd seen anything written by his brother that it felt strange to hold it. Rusty rested his head on Thomas's lap, his presence steady and comforting. Thomas thought about what Eric had said, about their mother, about the years they had lost. It was hard to reconcile the person he was now with the boy he used to be. Back then, everything had seemed so simple. He and Eric had been close once, before life pulled them in different directions. Before the arguments, the disappointments, the misunderstandings. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but Rusty's soft breathing kept him anchored. He scratched behind the dog's ears, letting the familiar rhythm soothe him. Rusty wagged his tail slightly, a small reminder that not everything was complicated. Some things were simple, like the bond between a man and his dog. Eventually, Thomas set the slip of paper on the table and leaned back against the couch. He wasn't ready to call Eric yet. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after that. For now, he would focus on the life he had in front of him. This small apartment, the bookstore, and the dog who had become his constant companion. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The following day, Thomas went about his usual routine. Morning coffee with Sarah, stocking shelves, helping customers. The familiarity of the tasks helped steady him, giving him something to focus on other than the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in his mind. Rusty had made himself a favorite among the regulars. Children would kneel beside him, scratching his ears and giggling as he wagged his tail. Older customers would bring him small treats, slipping them to him when they thought Sarah wasn't looking. Thomas found himself smiling more often than not, the sight of Rusty's contentment reminding him that life didn't have to be so heavy all the time. One afternoon, a young woman entered the store carrying a worn canvas bag. She looked around hesitantly before approaching the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "Do you have any books on local history?" Sarah nodded, motioning toward a section near the back. "Right over there. Let me know if you need help finding anything specific." The woman thanked her and made her way to the shelves. Thomas watched as she browsed, her fingers brushing over the spines of the books. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the thoughtful way she considered each title before pulling it off the shelf. Rusty trotted over to her, his tail wagging. She crouched down to pet him, smiling as he leaned into her touch. "Well, aren't you a friendly one?" she said, her tone warm. Thomas found himself stepping closer, unsure why he felt the need to introduce himself. "His name's Rusty," he said. The woman looked up, her smile widening. "Rusty? That's a good name. He's a sweetheart." Thomas nodded, suddenly feeling a bit awkward. "Yeah, he's a good dog." She stood, holding a book in her hand. "Do you work here?" Yeah, just started a little while ago." She glanced around the store. "It's a nice place. Cozy." He nodded again, unsure of what else to say. She seemed to sense his hesitation and offered a friendly smile. "Thanks for the help. I think I'll take this one." She walked back to the counter and Thomas followed. Sarah rang up her purchase, chatting briefly before the woman left with a wave. Thomas watched her go, a strange sense of familiarity lingering in her wake. "New regular, maybe," Sarah said, breaking him out of his thoughts. "Yeah," Thomas replied, though he wasn't sure why the encounter had left him feeling unsettled. Over the next few days, Thomas fell back into the rhythm of working at the bookstore. Each morning began with coffee and a few quiet moments before the doors opened. Customers came and went, each one adding a small piece to the tapestry of the store's life. Thomas found himself getting to know some of them, what genres they preferred, the books they'd recommend. It was a slow, steady process, but it was one he was beginning to enjoy. Rusty remained the store's unofficial mascot, his friendly demeanor drawing people in. Thomas often found himself smiling at the sight of children giggling as they petted Rusty, or older patrons slipping him treats. It was a small thing, but it brought a warmth to the store that Thomas hadn't realized he needed. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas began to feel a sense of belonging he hadn't known in years. The store wasn't just a place to work. It was a place where he felt safe, a place where he could breathe. But the memory of Eric's visit lingered. The slip of paper with his brother's number remained on the table in the apartment, a constant reminder that there was still a part of his life he hadn't faced. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever, but each time he thought about calling, doubt crept in. What would he say? What could he say that would make up for the years he had spent running? One evening, as the store closed and Sarah prepared to head home, she paused at the door. "You know, it's okay to take small steps," she said, her voice gentle. "You don't have to have it all figured out at once." Thomas looked up from the shelf he was straightening. "What do you mean?" She smiled softly. "You've come a long way, Thomas. You don't have to rush. Just take it one day at a time." He nodded, her words sinking in. Maybe that was the answer, not to try and solve everything all at once, but to take it slow, to let things unfold naturally. That night, as he sat on the couch with Rusty at his feet, Thomas picked up the slip of paper again. He stared at it for a long time before finally folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. Not tonight, but soon. He wasn't ready yet, but he was getting closer. And for now, that was enough. Thomas found himself replaying the encounter with Eric in his mind, though he tried not to let it show. Each morning he went downstairs, drank coffee with Sarah, and then threw himself into his work. Rusty stayed close by, his steady presence a comforting constant. The bookstore felt like its own small world, one where the rest of the city's chaos faded into the background. It should have been enough to keep him grounded, but that slip of paper still sat on the edge of his mind. It wasn't just the words Eric had said. It was the look on his face, the way his voice had softened when he mentioned their mom. Thomas hadn't thought about her in years. Not really. When he first left, he'd told himself it was because he needed to escape the arguments, the tension, the feeling of never quite measuring up. But over time, he'd stopped thinking about her entirely. He'd buried it so deep that even her name felt unfamiliar. Sarah didn't push him to talk, but he could tell she noticed. She had a knack for reading people without saying much, a skill that made her a natural at running the store. Sometimes, when things were quiet, she'd glance his way and ask, "How's it going?" in a way that left the door open. If he wanted to talk, he could. If he didn't, she'd let it be. For the most part, Thomas just said, "I'm fine," and that was that. But one evening, after the store had closed and they were locking up, he lingered by the counter. Sarah tilted her head slightly, waiting. She didn't press, just leaned on the edge of the counter with her coffee cup in hand. "I ran into my brother," Thomas said finally. Sarah nodded, not looking surprised. "I figured it was something like that. He said Mom's been waiting for me to come home." Sarah didn't respond right away, giving him space to keep going. "I left a long time ago," he continued, "and I never looked back, but now—" He trailed off, staring at the floor. Rusty lay nearby, ears twitching as he listened to their voices. Sarah set her coffee down. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up when you least expect it. Thomas let out a small, humorless laugh. "Tell me about it." She smiled softly. "It's not always a bad thing, though. Maybe it's a chance to sort through what you've been carrying around." He looked up at her, unsure how to respond. The idea of sorting through his past felt like opening a box of old photographs he'd rather leave untouched. But at the same time, part of him knew she was right. He couldn't keep running forever. The next morning, Thomas went about his routine as usual, though his thoughts were more distracted than usual. Rusty seemed to notice, staying closer than ever, occasionally nudging Thomas's leg as if to remind him that he wasn't alone. The store was quieter than normal, giving Thomas more time to think. Around midday, Sarah handed him a box of books that needed to be shelved in the back. "Why don't you take a few minutes after this? Clear your head." He nodded, grateful for the small gesture. After placing the books where they belonged, he stepped outside into the alley behind the store. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that hinted at the changing seasons. Rusty trotted out after him, sniffing around before sitting at his feet. Thomas leaned against the wall, staring at the city skyline in the distance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the slip of paper with Eric's number. It was worn around the edges, as if he'd been carrying it forever. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Rusty let out a soft whine, tilting his head. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, boy," Thomas said quietly. "It's been so long. What if nothing's the same anymore?" Rusty wagged his tail slightly, as if to say it didn't matter. Thomas took a deep breath and slipped the paper back into his pocket. He wasn't ready yet, but the idea of calling Eric didn't feel as impossible as it had before. Maybe he just needed a little more time. Thomas returned inside, feeling the cool air still clinging to his skin as he and Rusty stepped back into the warmth of the bookstore. Sarah was organizing a display near the front window, glancing up when she saw him enter. "You okay?" she asked, brushing her hands off on her jeans. "Yeah," Thomas replied. "Just needed some air." Sarah studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, but she didn't push. Instead, she nodded toward a stack of books waiting on the counter. "I was just about to start on these. Could use an extra hand." "Sure," he said, glad for the distraction. Rusty settled near the counter, content to lie in the patch of sunlight streaming through the glass. Thomas picked up a few books, his fingers brushing over their smooth covers. The titles were a mix of genres, mysteries, biographies, a couple of cookbooks. He started placing them on the appropriate shelves, letting the familiar routine calm his thoughts. The store wasn't crowded that afternoon. A few regulars came and went, chatting briefly with Sarah or browsing quietly. One older woman spent nearly an hour in the travel section, flipping through guidebooks and reminiscing aloud about trips she'd taken years ago. Sarah listened patiently, nodding along and offering suggestions for new destinations to explore. Thomas found himself watching the interaction, marveling at the ease with which Sarah connected with people. She made it look effortless. Her kindness was genuine, and it wasn't something Thomas had encountered often in his own life. He wondered if he'd ever be that comfortable talking to strangers, if he'd ever be able to put people at ease the way she did. By the time evening rolled around, the store was quiet again. Sarah was tallying the day's sales, her pen scratching softly against the paper. Thomas leaned against a bookshelf, watching as the shadows grew longer outside. Rusty stirred, stretching his legs before resting his head on his paws. Sarah glanced up from her notebook. "You've been pretty quiet today." "Just thinking," he said. "Anything you want to share?" He hesitated. "Not sure yet." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Fair enough." When they closed up for the night, Sarah handed Thomas the store key, as she always did. "See you tomorrow?" "Yeah," he replied. "I'll be here." Back in the apartment, Thomas sat on the couch, Rusty curled up beside him. The dog's steady breathing filled the room, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Thomas leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The slip of paper with Eric's number was still in his pocket, but he didn't pull it out this time. He just sat there, letting the weight of the day settle around him. It wasn't just the conversation with Eric that lingered in his mind. It was everything that had happened since he'd come to the bookstore. The stability, the routine, the sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't sure he deserved. But he was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could learn to accept it. For now, that was enough. The next morning, Thomas woke up to Rusty's usual routine of stretching, yawning, and softly pawing at his leg. He smiled faintly, reaching down to scratch the dog's head. "All right, buddy. Let's get going." As the morning light crept into the room, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The rhythm of his days at the bookstore, the quiet companionship of Rusty, and the steady presence of Sarah had slowly eased the tension he carried. But the slip of paper in his pocket remained a reminder of unfinished business. Thomas made his way downstairs, Rusty at his heels. Sarah was already at the counter, sipping her coffee and looking over the schedule for the week. "Morning," she greeted, smiling. "Morning," Thomas replied. He poured himself a cup of coffee and joined her. "Anything special on the agenda?" "Just a few orders to unpack," she said, nodding toward a stack of boxes near the back. "Some new releases came in yesterday. Thought we'd put them out this morning." "Sounds good," he said. "I'll get started." As the day unfolded, Thomas focused on the task at hand. Unpacking the books, checking them against the order list, and finding the right spots on the shelves. Rusty stayed close by, occasionally wandering over to greet customers. The familiar routine was comforting, a welcome distraction from the thoughts that circled in his mind. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that Sarah approached him. "Got a minute?" she asked. Thomas set down the books he was sorting. "Sure, what's up?" She leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking. We're coming up on the anniversary of the store's opening. It's been 10 years. "That's a long time," Thomas said. "Congratulations." "Thanks," she said with a small smile. "I usually do something to celebrate. A small event, some discounts for the regulars, that kind of thing." He nodded. "Sounds like a good idea." Sarah hesitated before continuing. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to help me plan it. Maybe come up with a few ideas?" Thomas was caught off guard. "Me?" She nodded. "You've got a good sense for what people like. And I think it would mean a lot to the customers to see you more involved." He considered it for a moment. He wasn't used to being asked for his input, let alone on something like this. But the thought of contributing to the store's celebration, of being a part of its history, was strangely appealing. "Sure," he said finally. "I'd be happy to help." Sarah's smile widened. "Great! We can brainstorm after closing." As the day wore on, Thomas found himself thinking about what they could do for the anniversary. Maybe a book signing with a local author, or a raffle for a gift basket. He made a mental note to jot down ideas later. When the store closed for the evening, Thomas and Sarah sat at the small table in the back, a notebook open between them. They tossed around ideas, some more practical than others, and gradually started shaping a plan. Rusty lay nearby, content to nap while they worked. It felt good to contribute, to have a say in something that mattered. As they wrapped up for the night, Sarah glanced at him. "Thanks, Thomas. I really appreciate your input." "Glad I could help," he said. And he meant it. Back in the apartment, Thomas settled on the couch, Rusty curled up beside him. He thought about the day, about the progress he'd made, about the trust Sarah had shown in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. The slip of paper in his pocket was still there, still waiting. But tonight, he felt no rush to pull it out. It could wait a little longer. The next morning, Thomas woke to the sound of Rusty's paws tapping against the floor. The dog was already up and stretching, his tail wagging. Thomas rubbed his eyes and sat up, feeling a little more rested than usual. "Hungry already, huh?" Thomas said, scratching behind Rusty's ears. The dog gave a happy huff, as if to say, "Of course." Thomas got dressed quickly, pulled on his boots, and headed downstairs. Sarah was just unlocking the front door, her breath visible in the chilly air. She smiled as he approached, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Good morning," she greeted. "You're up early." "Rusty's schedule doesn't allow sleeping in," Thomas joked. He accepted the coffee she offered and took a sip. The warmth seeped into him, chasing away the last remnants of sleep. As the morning wore on, Thomas found himself increasingly comfortable in his routine. The store had become a haven, a place where he felt like he had a purpose, where he wasn't just passing the time. Customers came and went, their faces becoming more familiar with each passing week. Some even knew his name now, calling out a cheerful, "Hi, Thomas," as they walked through the door. Rusty had earned a reputation as the bookstore's unofficial mascot. Children would run up to him, laughing as they patted his head or scratched his back. Even the more reserved patrons seemed to relax when they saw him lounging near the counter. Thomas couldn't help but smile every time he caught Rusty wagging his tail at yet another visitor. It was a steady life, a good life. And yet, that slip of paper in his pocket was always there. A constant reminder that there was a part of him still unresolved. He carried it around like a talisman, not quite ready to let go, not quite ready to confront the past. One afternoon, as Thomas was stocking a shelf, a young boy approached him. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, clutching a well-worn copy of a fantasy novel. "Excuse me," the boy said timidly. "Do you have the next book in this series?" Thomas crouched down to his level, scanning the cover. He recognized the series. Sarah had mentioned it before, saying it was popular with younger readers. "I think we do," Thomas said. "Let me check." He led the boy to the correct section, scanning the shelves until he found the next book in the series. When he handed it to the boy, the child's face lit up. "Thanks," the boy said, clutching the book tightly. Thomas nodded, smiling as the boy hurried back to his parent. It was such a small moment, but it stayed with him the rest of the day. He found himself wondering if he'd ever had someone to guide him to the next book, the next step. Maybe that's what he had now, in a way. A place to be. People who cared. That evening, after the store closed, Sarah approached him. "You've been doing great," she said, leaning against the counter. "I hope you know that." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "Thanks. I like it here." "Well, the customers like you," she said with a grin. "And Rusty seems happy too." Rusty, as if on cue, let out a contented sigh from his spot on the floor. Sarah laughed softly, then turned serious again. "If you ever want to talk," she said, "about anything, your brother, your past, I'm here." Thomas nodded, appreciating her words, even if he wasn't ready to open up yet. "I know. Thank you." As he climbed the stairs to his apartment that night, he felt the weight of her words. Maybe one day he'd tell her everything. About the years on the streets, the reasons he'd left home, the shame he still carried. But for now, he was content to take it one day at a time. That night, as Rusty snored softly beside him, Thomas lay awake for a long time, staring at the slip of paper on his nightstand. He hadn't thrown it away, hadn't tried to forget it. It was still there, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, he was getting closer to the moment when he'd be ready to use it. For now, though, he let the steady rhythm of Rusty's breathing lull him into a quiet, dreamless sleep. Thomas woke the next morning to the sound of Rusty's nails clicking on the floor. The dog was already at the door, wagging his tail in anticipation of their daily routine. Thomas yawned and stretched, feeling the familiar pull of muscles still waking up. The past few weeks had settled into a pattern, one that was comforting, but also left him with plenty of time to think. Too much time, sometimes. As he pulled on his boots, his fingers brushed against the piece of paper in his pocket. He froze for a moment, then pushed it aside. Not today. Not yet. Downstairs, Sarah was arranging a new display near the front of the store. She glanced up as Thomas entered. "Morning," she said with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Yeah," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Anything special planned for today?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," Sarah said. "A few shipments coming in, some orders to pack up. Should be a pretty normal day." Thomas nodded, grateful for the familiarity of the tasks. He liked the way the store had its own rhythm, its own quiet hum of life. Customers drifted in and out, chatting softly, flipping through pages, leaving with new stories tucked under their arms. It was a far cry from the chaos and uncertainty of the years before. Rusty had made himself at home in the store, of course. He had his favorite spots, the sunny patch by the front window, the cool corner near the mystery section. Customers loved him. Children would crouch down to pet him, and more than a few regulars brought treats just for him. Watching Rusty thrive made Thomas feel like he'd done at least one thing right. By mid-afternoon, the steady flow of customers slowed. Sarah handed Thomas a clipboard. "Would you mind checking the inventory in the back room? I think we might be running low on a few popular titles." "Sure," he said. He liked the quiet of the back room, where he could lose himself in the rows of neatly stacked books. Rusty followed him, padding along at his heels. As he worked through the list, Thomas's mind wandered. He thought about the boy who had come in the other day, so eager to find the next book in his favorite series. He thought about the elderly man who always asked for World War II memoirs, and the woman who seemed to devour every new romance novel they put on the shelves. These people, these small connections, they were starting to mean something to him. Rusty settled on the floor nearby, watching him with curious eyes. "You've got it all figured out, don't you?" Thomas muttered. Rusty's tail wagged once, as if in agreement. Thomas finished the inventory check and returned to the front of the store. Sarah was chatting with a regular customer, her easy smile and genuine interest shining through as always. He handed her the clipboard. "Looks like we're low on a few of those best sellers. Should I place an order?" She nodded. "That'd be great. Thanks." He sat at the desk and started on the order forms. The quiet focus of the task felt good, grounding. As he worked, he heard the soft murmur of Sarah and the customer's conversation, the faint rustle of pages turning, and the occasional tap of Rusty's nails on the floor. It was the sound of a life he never thought he'd have. By the end of the day, the store was winding down. The last few customers paid for their books and left, and Sarah began locking up. Thomas helped her straighten the shelves one last time, the two of them working in companionable silence. When the door was finally locked and the lights dimmed, Sarah turned to him. "Hey, I was thinking..." He glanced up from where he was stacking some flyers. "Yeah? Why don't you take a day off soon?" she suggested. "You've been working hard, and everyone needs a break now and then." Thomas shook his head. "I'm fine. I like staying busy." She gave him a knowing look. "I know you do, but maybe take a day to do something just for yourself. Go for a long walk with Rusty, catch a movie, whatever you feel like." He hesitated. The idea of a day off seemed foreign to him. For so long, his life had been about survival, about doing whatever was necessary to get by. The concept of taking time for himself felt almost indulgent. "Maybe," he said finally. Sarah smiled. "Just think about it." That night, back in the apartment, Thomas sat on the couch with Rusty curled up beside him. He thought about what Sarah had said. A day off. Time to do something just for himself. He wasn't sure he even knew what that would look like. What did he enjoy? What made him happy, outside of the quiet satisfaction of work and the comfort of Rusty's presence? The slip of paper in his pocket tugged at his thoughts again. Maybe that was what he needed to do. Maybe that was the thing he'd been putting off for too long. But the thought of calling Eric, of opening that door, still made his chest tighten. Not yet, he murmured to himself. Rusty stirred, his ears twitching, but he didn't wake. Thomas reached down and scratched the dog's head, letting the motion calm him. The next morning, Thomas woke early and decided to take Rusty for a long walk before heading down to the store. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft golden light over the city. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle still a few hours away. Rusty trotted happily at his side, his nose twitching as he sniffed at every interesting scent they passed. As they walked, Thomas found himself relaxing. The rhythmic sound of Rusty's paws on the pavement, the cool morning air, the gentle hum of the city waking up. It all felt strangely peaceful. For a little while, he let his mind wander, taking in the sights and sounds without the weight of the past pressing on him. When they returned to the apartment, Rusty flopped down on the rug, content and tired from their walk. Thomas glanced at the clock. He still had plenty of time before the store opened. He sat down at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. The slip of paper was right there, just within reach. Maybe today was the day. Maybe it wasn't. He wasn't sure. But the idea no longer filled him with dread. It was a step forward, even if he wasn't quite ready to take it yet. For now, he had the store, he had Rusty, and he had a life that felt steady for the first time in years. That was enough. As Thomas woke that morning, Rusty was already sitting by the door, his tail wagging faintly. The dog seemed to sense that something was different about today. Thomas sat up slowly, rubbing his face and blinking at the morning light streaming through the window. His hand brushed against the folded piece of paper on the nightstand. It had been there so long that he barely noticed it anymore, but now it felt heavier somehow. "Today, huh?" he murmured. Rusty tilted his head, ears flicking as if waiting for further explanation. Thomas stood and got dressed, his movements slow, deliberate. He took a deep breath and pocketed the paper before heading downstairs. The store was still quiet, the familiar smell of coffee and books wrapping around him like a warm blanket. Sarah was behind the counter, stacking some new arrivals. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning," he replied. He hesitated before adding, "Sarah?" She glanced up, her hands pausing on the stack of books. "Do you think people can really go back after a long time? To something they left behind?" She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I think it depends on what you mean by go back. Sometimes you can't return to the way things were, but you can still reconnect, maybe even build something new. Why do you ask?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "I've been carrying this," he said, pulling out the slip of paper and holding it up. "My brother's number. He came here a while ago, and I've been putting it off." Sarah nodded slowly. "And now you're thinking it might be time." "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it might be." She smiled gently. "You've come a long way, Thomas. Whatever happens, you'll handle it." Thomas felt a weight lift from her words. It wasn't gone, but it felt manageable. He slipped the paper back into his pocket and nodded. Thanks. He spent the rest of the morning going through the motions, stacking books, assisting customers, chatting briefly with regulars. But his mind was elsewhere. Rusty stayed close by, his calm presence steadying Thomas in a way nothing else could. By the time the afternoon lull arrived, Thomas had made up his mind. He told Sarah he was stepping out for a bit and headed toward the small park a few blocks away. It was quiet there, the sounds of the city muffled by the trees and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Thomas sat on a bench and pulled out his phone. The paper in his hand felt worn and fragile, but he unfolded it carefully and dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello?" "Eric," Thomas said, his throat tightening around the word. There was a pause. Then, "Thomas, is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," he said. I thought it was time we talked." The relief in Eric's voice was immediate. "I'm so glad you called. I've been hoping I'd hear from you." Thomas felt his chest tighten again, but he pressed on. "I'm sorry for disappearing. I should have reached out sooner." "Hey, it's okay," Eric said. "The important thing is that you're here now. Where are you? Can we meet?" Thomas hesitated. "I'm in the city. There's this bookstore I've been working at. It's kind of become home." Eric's voice was warm. "I'd love to see it. And to see you." They arranged to meet the next day at the store. Thomas hung up and sat on the bench for a while longer, Rusty lying at his feet. He scratched behind the dog's ears and let out a shaky breath. "Guess it's finally happening," he murmured. The next morning, Thomas was more anxious than he'd been in years. Even as he went through the usual routine, opening the store, making coffee, greeting early customers, he felt a nervous energy humming beneath the surface. Rusty seemed to pick up on it, staying closer than usual and nudging Thomas's hand whenever he paused for too long. When Eric walked through the door, Thomas froze. His older brother looked the same in many ways. Broad shoulders, a calm demeanor, but there was something in his face that had softened over the years. Thomas stepped out from behind the counter, unsure of what to say. Eric smiled, his voice steady. "Hey, little brother." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Hey." They stood there for a moment, the years of silence hanging between them. Then Eric held out his hand, and Thomas took it, the handshake quickly turning into a brief, awkward hug. Rusty trotted over, sniffing at Eric and wagging his tail. "Is this your dog?" Eric asked, crouching down to pet him. "Yeah, that's Rusty," Thomas said. "He's been with me for a while now." Rusty leaned into Eric's hand, his tail thumping against the floor. Eric smiled. "Good dog." Sarah appeared from the back, her expression curious but kind. Thomas introduced her to Eric, and she nodded warmly. "Nice to meet you," she said, before slipping away to give them space. Thomas and Eric sat at a small table in the corner of the store. At first, the conversation was halting, both of them unsure of how to start. But gradually, they found their rhythm. Eric asked about the store, about Rusty, about how Thomas had been. Thomas answered honestly, though he left out some of the darker details. He asked about their mother, about Eric's life, about what had changed in the years they'd been apart. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. They talked until the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something close to peace. As Eric got ready to leave, he placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I'm glad you called," he said. "I've missed you." Thomas nodded, his voice steady. "I've missed you too." They made plans to meet again soon. As Eric walked out the door, Thomas watched him go, a weight lifting from his chest. Rusty sat beside him, leaning into his leg. Thomas reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, a small smile tugging at his lips. He turned back to the store, the familiar smell of books and coffee wrapping around him like a warm embrace. The slip of paper was gone, and with it, the heavy burden he'd carried for so long. Thomas had made the call, and in doing so he had taken the first step toward healing the wounds of the past. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was enough to know that he wasn't alone. He had Rusty, he had Sarah, and now he had a chance to rebuild the connection with his family. It wasn't the ending of his journey, it was a new beginning.